History tends to simplify people. It turns them into symbols, heroes, or villains because neat labels are easier to remember than complicated truths. John F. Kennedy is one of those figures who has been polished by memory into something almost myth-like. Young, charismatic, inspiring. A president who spoke of hope, progress, and a brighter future. But that version of JFK is only part of the story. Behind the carefully crafted image was a leader navigating enormous pressure, making high-stakes decisions, and carrying flaws that were often hidden from public view. His presidency wasn't just a golden age of speeches and symbolism, it was also marked by missteps, risks, and moments that brought the world frighteningly close to disaster. So the real question isn't whether he was good or bad. It's more complicated than that. How effective and how dangerous was he, really? At first glance, JFK seemed almost designed for leadership. He was young, confident, and articulate in a way that felt fresh compared to older political figures. With Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis by his side, the White House took on an elegance that captivated the public. Together, they projected sophistication and cultural refinement, creating what many described as a modern American Camelot. But image and reality are rarely identical. Privately, Kennedy dealt with severe health issues, including chronic pain and serious medical conditions that required ongoing treatment. He relied on medications just to maintain the pace demanded by the presidency. This wasn't something the public fully understood at the time. The man who appeared energetic and in control on television was often struggling behind the scenes. And the pressure he faced was immense. The early 1960s were defined by Cold War tension, nuclear rivalry, and ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Every decision carried global consequences. Every mistake had the potential to escalate into catastrophe. That raises an uncomfortable question. Was JFK fully in control of events, or was he navigating forces far larger than himself while maintaining the appearance of control? To understand him, you also have to look at where he came from. Kennedy was not an outsider rising against the odds. He was born into wealth and influence in Brookline, Massachusetts. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was deeply involved in shaping his son's political career, opening doors and building connections that most people could never access. That doesn't erase JFK's achievements, but it does complicate the narrative. Yes, he showed genuine bravery as a naval officer during World War II, an experience that helped define his public image. But his path to power was also paved with privilege, strategic planning, and family backing. Even his victory over Richard Nixon in the 1960 election raises questions that still get debated. It was the first presidential election heavily influenced by television, and Kennedy's calm, confident appearance contrasted sharply with Nixon's more tense and visibly uncomfortable presence during the televised debates. Some argue that media image played a decisive role. Others point to campaign resources and political timing. Was it purely talent, or a combination of timing, presentation, and support? Once in office, the challenges became real, and so did the consequences of his decisions. One of the earliest and most damaging moments of his presidency was the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was a covert U.S.-backed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro by supporting Cuban exiles in an invasion of Cuba. The operation was poorly executed and quickly collapsed. Instead of weakening Castro, it strengthened his position and embarrassed the United States on the global stage. For a new president, it was a major failure, one that exposed weaknesses in decision-making and planning. Then came the most dangerous moment of his presidency, and arguably one of the most dangerous moments in human history: the Cuban Missile Crisis. When U.S. intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. Kennedy faced a choice: act aggressively and risk escalation, or seek a diplomatic solution while appearing strong. The tension lasted for days, with the possibility of catastrophic conflict looming over every move. Kennedy is often praised for how he handled the crisis. He chose a naval blockade and engaged in back-channel negotiations with Nikita Khrushchev, ultimately reaching a deal that avoided war. But critics point out that earlier U.S. actions, such as placing missiles in Turkey and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, had already contributed to rising tensions. In other words, he helped resolve a crisis, but he was also part of the chain of events that created it. His foreign policy challenges didn't stop there. Kennedy also increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War by sending military advisors and expanding his support for South Vietnam. While this didn't escalate into full-scale war during his presidency, it laid the groundwork for deeper U.S. military involvement in the years that followed. These decisions show a pattern. Kennedy often operated in gray areas, making choices that were neither clearly right nor clearly wrong in the moment, but carried long-term consequences. His personal life adds another layer of complexity. Reports of multiple affairs and relationships have been widely discussed by historians. In the context of the Cold War, this wasn't just a matter of personal morality, it raised serious concerns about security risks and vulnerability to blackmail. A president's private behavior could potentially have public consequences, especially during a time of intense global rivalry. This contrast between public image and private reality is hard to ignore. The inspiring leader seen by millions was also a flawed individual making questionable personal decisions. So the question becomes, can a leader still be considered great if their private life shows recklessness? And yet, despite all of this, Kennedy's presidency wasn't defined solely by mistakes. He also set in motion achievements that left a lasting mark on history. One of his most iconic contributions was his vision for space exploration. In 1961, he challenged the United States to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. At the time, it seemed almost impossible. But that vision led directly to the Apollo 11 moon landing, a moment that symbolized human innovation and determination. His leadership also intersected with the growing civil rights movement. Kennedy initially approached civil rights cautiously, but over time he became more vocal about the need for change. He proposed legislation that would later contribute to major civil rights reforms. While he didn't live to see those laws passed, his administration helped push the issue into the national spotlight. In terms of global leadership, Kennedy demonstrated an ability to remain calm under pressure, especially during critical moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis. His willingness to avoid immediate military escalation likely prevented unimaginable destruction. So where does that leave us? JFK wasn't a perfect leader, but he wasn't reckless beyond redemption either. He made serious mistakes, some of which had lasting consequences. He also showed moments of restraint, vision, and leadership that shaped the course of history. He was a product of privilege, but also a man who faced extraordinary pressure. He projected confidence, even when dealing with personal and political struggles behind the scenes. Maybe the most accurate way to understand him is not as a hero or a villain, but as something more human, and therefore more complicated. And then, just as the world was still trying to define his legacy, everything changed. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Kennedy was assassinated. The official investigation concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The case was formally closed by the Warren Commission. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, questions remain. People still debate what really happened, what might have been overlooked, and whether there were forces behind the scenes that were never fully uncovered. The assassination didn't just end a presidency, it froze JFK in time, leaving behind a legacy that would always feel unfinished. And that's part of why the world reacted so strongly to his death. If he had lived longer, history might have judged him more clearly, either elevating him further or exposing more flaws. Instead, his life was cut short at a moment when his story was still being written. So how bad or how good was JFK? He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a villain. He was a powerful leader making high-stakes decisions in an unpredictable world. A man capable of both misjudgment and insight. Someone shaped by privilege, pressure, and the realities of his time. Maybe the real lesson isn't about labeling him at all. Maybe it's about understanding how power, circumstance, and human imperfection intersect, and how even the most admired leaders can exist in that uneasy space between greatness and risk.